Spring 1945, as the European theatre of World War II drew toward its dramatic conclusion, something extraordinary happened at a secret Luftwaffe test facility deep in Bavaria. A group of Germany's most experienced test pilots gathered around an aircraft that, just weeks earlier, had been their most feared adversary in the skies. The sleek, silver fighter sitting on the tarmac bore the unmistakable profile of the North American P-51 Mustang, the aircraft that had helped turn the tide of the air war over Europe. But this wasn't a museum piece or a war trophy. This was an operational fighter, captured nearly intact, and German High Command had ordered their best pilots to fly it, test it, and understand exactly why this American aircraft had proven so devastatingly effective against the Luftwaffe. What those German pilots discovered would leave them stunned, humbled, and forever change their understanding of aerial combat. This is the incredible true story of what happened when enemies flew each other's machines, when professional respect transcended wartime hatred, and when the harsh reality of technological superiority could no longer be denied. This is the story of the day German pilots admitted that they had been beaten not just by numbers, but by a machine unlike anything they had ever encountered. To understand the significance of this captured Mustang, we need to rewind to the beginning of the air war over Europe. In 1939 and 1940, the Luftwaffe was the most feared air force in the world. German pilots, flying the Messerschmitt Bf-109, had swept aside opposition in Poland, France, and the Low Countries with shocking efficiency. The Bf-109 was a formidable machine. Designed by Willy Messerschmitt in the mid-1930s, it featured cutting-edge technology for its time, an all-metal monocoque construction, retractable landing gear, an enclosed cockpit, and a powerful Daimler-Benz liquid-cooled engine. In the hands of experienced German pilots, many of whom had honed their skills during the Spanish Civil War, the 109 was a deadly weapon. During the Battle of Britain in 1940, the Bf-109 proved it could outperform the RAF's Hurricane in nearly every respect. Only the legendary Supermarine Spitfire could match it in combat, and even then, the 109 held advantages in certain flight regimes, particularly in the dive and in high-altitude performance. The early years of the war saw German air superiority extend across most of occupied Europe. Luftwaffe pilots racked up impressive victory counts, and aces like Werner Molders, Adolf Gauland, and Helmut Wick became household names in Germany. The tactical doctrines developed by the Luftwaffe, particularly the Finger Four formation and the boom and zoom attack strategy, proved devastatingly effective. For a time, it seemed that German aviation technology and pilot skill were simply unbeatable. But wars are not won by early advantages alone. As 1941 turned to 1942, and 1942 turned to 1943, the nature of the air war over Europe began to change dramatically. The United States had entered the conflict, bringing with it the massive industrial capacity of the American war machine. American bombers, primarily the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator, began appearing over Europe in ever-increasing numbers. The American strategy was simple in concept but brutal in execution. They would conduct daylight precision bombing raids deep into German-held territory, targeting factories, oil refineries, transportation networks, and anything else that fed the German war machine. Unlike the British, who had switched to nighttime area bombing after suffering unsustainable losses in daylight raids, the Americans believed that their heavily armed bombers, flying in tight formation, could fight their way to the target and back without fighter escort. This belief would prove tragically wrong. The early American daylight bombing campaign was a bloodbath. German fighters, primarily the Bf-109 and its stablemate the Focke-Wulf FW-190, tore into the bomber formations with devastating effect. Despite the bombers' impressive defensive armament, each B-17 carrying 13 50 caliber machine guns, the losses were horrific. Entire squadrons were wiped out. Crews who survived one mission knew their odds of surviving a full tour of 25 missions were slim. The problem was range. American fighter aircraft of the period, primarily the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, simply couldn't escort the bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany. The P-47, a massive radial engine fighter that was nearly indestructible and packed 8 50 caliber machine guns, could only accompany the bombers partway before having to turn back. The P-38, with its distinctive twin-boom design, had better range but suffered from engine reliability issues in the cold, high-altitude European climate. This meant that for the deepest penetrations into German territory, the bombers flew alone, unescorted, running a gauntlet of German fighters that would hit them again and again, from the moment they crossed into occupied territory until they limped back toward England. The German pilots called it the happy hunting time. American bomber crews called it something far less printable. The crisis reached its peak in October 1943, during a raid on the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, deep in southern Germany. Of the 291 B-17s that set out that morning, 60 were shot down and another 138 were damaged, many so badly they would never fly again. Over 600 American airmen were killed or captured in a single day. The 8th Air Force had suffered a catastrophic defeat, and it became clear that the daylight bombing campaign could not continue without a solution to the escort problem. The solution, when it came, would arrive in the form of an aircraft that had, ironically, been initially rejected by the very service that would make it legendary. The P-51 Mustang had been designed in 1940 by North American Aviation, built to a British specification for a new fighter. The British Purchasing Commission, desperate for aircraft as the Battle of Britain raged, had approached North American with a request to build the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk under license. North American's chief designer, Edgar Schmude, a German immigrant who had fled Europe in the 1920s, proposed something different. "Give us 120 days, he said, and we'll design you a completely new fighter, one that will be better than anything currently flying." It was an audacious claim, but Schmude and his team delivered. In an astoundingly short period, they designed and built a prototype of what would become the P-51. The aircraft featured innovative design elements, particularly its laminar flow wing, which reduced drag and gave the aircraft exceptional performance. When the British received the first Mustangs in 1941, they were impressed by its handling and its remarkable range, but disappointed by its performance at high altitude. The Allison engine that powered the early Mustangs simply couldn't deliver enough power above 15,000 feet. But someone at the Royal Air Force had a brilliant idea. What if they took the Mustang's excellent airframe and married it to Britain's best engine, the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same engine that powered the Spitfire? The Merlin featured a two-stage supercharger that maintained power output at high altitude, exactly what the Mustang needed. The marriage of American airframe and British engine created something extraordinary. The P-51B, the first Merlin-powered Mustang to enter service, could fly faster, higher, and farther than any other fighter in the world. With drop tanks, it had a range of over 2,000 miles. It could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. And in combat, it could outperform anything the Luftwaffe could put in the air. The first P-51Bs began arriving in England in late 1943. By early 1944, they were flying escort missions deep into Germany. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Suddenly, the bombers weren't flying alone anymore. Suddenly, there were American fighters over Berlin, over Munich, over every corner of the Third Reich. The happy hunting time was over. German pilots, who had grown accustomed to having things largely their own way against the bombers, now found themselves fighting for their lives against an opponent that was faster, more maneuverable, and had better range than anything they flew. The psychological impact was as significant as the tactical one. If American fighters could appear over Berlin, if no corner of German airspace was safe, then the war was truly coming home. The Mustang didn't just escort bombers. P-51 pilots soon went on the offensive, sweeping ahead of the bomber formations, attacking German airfields, strafing aircraft on the ground, and engaging in dogfights with Luftwaffe fighters whenever they could find them. The goal was not just to protect the bombers but to actively destroy the Luftwaffe, to achieve air superiority through aggressive action. And it worked. Through 1944, the Luftwaffe bled itself white trying to stop the combined British and American air offensive. Experienced pilots were killed faster than they could be replaced. Fuel shortages limited training hours for new pilots, who then died in combat before they could gain experience. Aircraft production actually increased through 1944, despite the bombing campaign, but there was no one to fly them and no fuel to put in their tanks. By the spring of 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. The pilots who remained were either inexperienced boys rushed through truncated training programs, or hardened veterans who had somehow survived when so many of their comrades had not. These veterans, men who had been flying and fighting since the early days of the war, knew exactly how desperate their situation had become. The Mustang had become a symbol of that desperation. Every German pilot knew the distinctive profile of the P-51. They knew its performance characteristics. They knew that encountering a group of Mustangs meant they were likely flying their last mission. The silver fighter with the bubble canopy and the characteristic sound of its Merlin engine had become the angel of death for the Luftwaffe. But knowing an opponent's reputation and understanding exactly why they're superior are two different things. The Luftwaffe's test pilots and technical staff had managed to examine crashed Mustangs, studying the wreckage, taking measurements, analyzing the design. But wreckage can only tell you so much. To truly understand an aircraft, to comprehend why it performs the way it does, you need to fly it. That opportunity came in March 1945, though the exact circumstances of how the Luftwaffe acquired a flyable P-51 remain somewhat murky, obscured by the chaos of the war's final months and the incomplete records of a dying regime. What we know is that a P-51D Mustang, one of the later production models with the bubble canopy and 650 caliber machine guns, force-landed somewhere in German-held territory relatively intact. The pilot, whose name has been lost to history, had either been hit by ground fire, suffered mechanical failure, or perhaps simply gotten lost and run out of fuel. Whatever the reason, he put the aircraft down in a field without destroying it. He was almost certainly captured immediately, likely spending the rest of the war as a prisoner, never knowing that his aircraft would go on to serve the enemy, if only briefly. German forces quickly secured the aircraft and transported it to one of the Luftwaffe's test facilities. Despite the increasingly chaotic military situation, with Allied forces closing in from both east and west, someone in the German command structure decided that understanding this aircraft was important enough to divert precious resources to the effort. The Mustang was carefully examined, repaired where necessary, fueled, and prepared for flight testing. The test facility chosen was Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's primary aircraft test center, located in northeastern Germany. Rechlin had been the site where virtually every German military aircraft had been evaluated since the 1930s. It was here that the Bf-109 had first proven its worth, where the FW-190 had been refined, where captured Allied aircraft were routinely tested to understand their capabilities and vulnerabilities. By March 1945, Rechlin was operating under increasingly difficult conditions. Allied bombing had damaged facilities. Fuel was scarce. Personnel were being diverted to combat units as the military situation deteriorated. But the institution remained, staffed by some of Germany's most experienced test pilots, men who had flown virtually every type of aircraft imaginable. These were not ordinary pilots. Test pilots are a breed apart, even in the rarefied world of fighter aviation. They need not just flying skill but technical knowledge, analytical ability, and a certain detachment that allows them to evaluate an aircraft objectively even in combat conditions. The men chosen to fly the captured Mustang were the best of the best, pilots who had thousands of hours of experience in dozens of different aircraft types. The senior pilot selected for the evaluation was Hauptmann Heinz Bahr, one of the Luftwaffe's most successful aces with over 220 victories. Bahr was not just a skilled combat pilot but an experienced test pilot who had evaluated numerous aircraft types. He was known for his analytical mind and his willingness to speak honestly about an aircraft's capabilities, even when that honesty was unwelcome to his superiors. Joining him were several other highly experienced pilots, including men who had flown combat missions since the Spanish Civil War, who had fought over Britain in 1940, over Russia from 1941 onward, and over the Rhine itself as the walls closed in. These were men who knew the Bf-109 inside and out, who had flown the FW-190 in combat, who had tested captured Spitfires, Russian Yaks, and American P-47s. They approached the Mustang with a mixture of professional curiosity and something approaching dread. This was the aircraft that had been systematically destroying their comrades for over a year. This was the symbol of their defeat in the air. But they were professionals, and they would evaluate it professionally, regardless of what they might find. The first impression was how different it looked up close compared to seeing it in combat. The Mustang was larger than a Bf-109, about the same size as an FW-190, but it seemed more substantial somehow, more solid. The quality of the construction was immediately apparent. The fit and finish of the panels, the quality of the paint, the engineering visible in the details, all spoke to a level of manufacturing precision that Germany, with its bomb-damaged factories and increasingly desperate resource situation, could no longer match. The cockpit was a revelation. American ergonomics were simply superior. Everything was logically placed, clearly labeled, easy to reach. The instrument panel was comprehensive but not cluttered. The visibility from the bubble canopy was extraordinary, far better than the increasingly cramped cockpits of late-war German fighters. The seat was comfortable, adjustable, clearly designed with the pilot's welfare in mind. This might seem like a minor point, but it's actually profoundly important. A pilot who is comfortable, who can easily reach all controls, who has excellent visibility, and who doesn't have to struggle with the aircraft systems is a pilot who can focus on fighting. The Mustang was designed with the understanding that the human being in the cockpit was the most important component of the system, and every other aspect of the design existed to support the human's ability to fight effectively. German late-war fighters, by contrast, had been designed with increasing desperation, focusing on raw performance while sacrificing pilot comfort and ease of use. The Bf-109G, the most common variant in 1945, was cramped, difficult to see out of, and had controls that became increasingly heavy at high speeds. The pilot wasn't working with the aircraft so much as wrestling with it. The German pilots examining the Mustang couldn't help but notice these differences. Here was an aircraft from a nation that was winning the war, that could afford to think about pilot comfort and long-term efficiency. It was a stark reminder of just how dire Germany's situation had become. The technical briefing before the first flight covered the basics. The Packard Merlin engine, a license-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin producing 1,490 horsepower with water methanol injection. 6 50 caliber machine guns with 1,880 rounds total ammunition. Maximum speed of 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Service ceiling of 41,900 feet. Range, with drop tanks, of over 2,000 miles. These were numbers that made the German pilots exchange glances. Their aircraft couldn't match any of these figures. But numbers on paper are one thing. How an aircraft actually flies, how it feels, how it responds to control inputs, that's what separates good aircraft from great ones. And that's what Hauptmann Barr was about to discover as he settled into the cockpit for the first flight. The engine start procedure was straightforward, similar enough to other liquid-cooled engines that Barr had no trouble. The Merlin caught with a rumble and settled into a smooth idle. The sound was different from a Daimler-Benz engine, slightly rougher perhaps, but the power was immediately apparent. The aircraft trembled with barely restrained energy. Taxiing was easy, the visibility was excellent, and the wide-track landing gear made the aircraft stable on the ground. This was another point of difference. The Bf-109's narrow-track landing gear made it notoriously difficult to handle on the ground, resulting in countless accidents. The Mustang felt solid and controllable from the first moment. The takeoff run was short. The Mustang leaped off the ground with what felt like excessive power. Gear up, the aircraft accelerated rapidly, climbing at a rate that made Barr's experienced pilot instincts recalculate everything he thought he knew. This wasn't just good performance. This was something else entirely. At altitude, Barr began the systematic evaluation process. Straight and level flight first, checking stability, trim characteristics, control responsiveness. The Mustang was beautifully harmonized. The controls were light but precise. There was no tendency to wander or hunt. The aircraft simply went where you pointed it and stayed there until you told it to do something else. Then came the performance testing. Maximum speed runs at various altitudes. Rate of climb checks. Service ceiling verification. With each test, Barr's respect for the aircraft grew. The Mustang wasn't just good. It was exceptional. It did everything well, with no significant weaknesses. The roll rate was extraordinary. The Mustang could snap into a roll faster than any aircraft Barr had flown. The ailerons remained light and responsive even at high speeds, where German fighters' controls became heavy and sluggish. In a turning fight, the Mustang could reverse direction almost instantly, a crucial advantage in combat. The dive performance was spectacular. The Mustang accelerated smoothly in a dive, with no tendency to tuck under or become uncontrollable, problems that plagued many high-performance fighters of the era. You could point it straight down, let it build up tremendous speed, and then pull out smoothly and controllably. For a fighter pilot, this was invaluable. It meant you could attack from altitude, dive through an enemy formation, and escape before they could react. But it was the high-altitude performance that really drove home just how outclassed German fighters had become. At 25,000 feet and above, where much of the air combat over Europe took place, the Mustang's Merlin engine maintained power output that German engines simply couldn't match. The Daimler-Benz engines in the Bf109 and the BMW radials in the FW190 lost power as altitude increased, forcing German pilots to fight at a disadvantage. The Mustang, by contrast, seemed to get better at altitude. The controls remained responsive, the engine pulled strongly, and the aircraft felt nimble and eager. This explained so much about why American fighters had been so successful. They could fight at altitudes where German fighters struggled, and they could maintain that superiority for hours thanks to their incredible range. That range was perhaps the Mustang's most devastating capability. Barr had flown captured P-47 Thunderbolts before, and while they were impressive aircraft, rugged and powerful, their range was limited. The P-51 had somehow combined long range with excellent performance, a combination that German designers had never achieved. The fuel capacity was astounding. Internal fuel of 269 gallons, plus provision for two 75-gallon or 110-gallon drop tanks. This gave the aircraft the ability to fly deep into Germany, fight for an extended period, and still return to England. German fighters, by contrast, had to operate near their bases due to limited fuel capacity. This meant American fighters could choose when and where to fight, while German fighters had to fight on American terms or watch the bombers pass unmolested. After the first flight, Barr landed, taxied back to the dispersal area, and shut down the engine. As he climbed out of the cockpit, the other pilots crowded around, eager to hear his assessment. Barr was known for being direct and honest in his evaluations, and what he told them that day was both enlightening and deeply discouraging. The Mustang was, in his professional opinion, the best all-around fighter aircraft currently in service with any air force. It had no significant weaknesses. It was fast at all altitudes, maneuverable, well-armed, comfortable to fly, and had range that no other single-engine fighter could match. Fighting against it in a Bf109 or FW190 meant you were at a disadvantage from the start, and only superior tactics or pilot skill could level the odds. Over the following days, other pilots flew the captured Mustang. Each came away with the same conclusion. This was the aircraft they wished they had been flying. This was the machine that could have changed the outcome of the air war, if only Germany had possessed it instead of America. The reports written by these test pilots make for fascinating and melancholy reading. They are professional, detailed, technical documents, full of measurements and performance figures. But between the lines, you can read the frustration and dismay of men who understood exactly how badly they had been beaten and why. One pilot noted that the Mustang's combination of speed, altitude performance, and range meant that German fighters could never be safe, anywhere. American fighters could appear over any target at any time, and German forces had no effective counter. Another pilot observed that the quality of construction and the attention to pilot comfort suggested an air force that expected its pilots to survive long enough to benefit from those features, a stark contrast to the increasingly desperate German situation where pilots were considered expendable. The fuel injection system drew particular praise. The Merlin engine would run smoothly in any attitude, unlike the early carburetor-equipped Merlins in Spitfires, which would cut out under negative G-forces. This gave the Mustang a crucial advantage in dogfights. You could push the nose down abruptly without the engine hesitating, while German pilots had learned that their fuel-injected engines gave them a similar advantage over Spitfires. The Americans had caught up and surpassed them. The armament was evaluated as well. Six 50-caliber machine guns, with 3 in each wing, provided tremendous firepower. While some German pilots preferred cannon armament, the Mustang's guns were perfectly adequate for destroying other fighters, and their high ammunition capacity meant you could engage multiple targets without running out of ammunition. The guns were also mounted close to the fuselage, which meant convergence and accuracy were excellent. The gun sight drew particular attention. The American K-14 computing gun sight was a gyroscopic lead computing sight that automatically adjusted for target lead based on range and angle. This was far more sophisticated than the simple ring and bead sight still common on many German fighters. A pilot using the K-14 had a significant advantage in deflection shooting, able to hit targets that would have been impossible with earlier sights. Every system, every detail of the Mustang, spoke to a design philosophy that prioritized the pilot's ability to fight effectively. The Americans had clearly spent enormous time and effort ensuring that every aspect of the aircraft worked together to create a superior combat system. This wasn't just good engineering. This was engineering backed by unlimited resources and a clear understanding of what was needed to win. The German pilots also noted how easy the Mustang was to fly. There were no vicious handling characteristics, no nasty stalls or spins, no tendencies that could catch out an inexperienced pilot. This meant that even relatively green American pilots could be effective in the Mustang, while German fighters required considerable experience to fly safely at their limits. This was a crucial point. By 1945, the Luftwaffe was desperately short of experienced pilots. New pilots were being rushed through training with as little as 100 hours of flight time, then thrown into combat against American pilots who often had 300 or 400 hours of training. Worse, the American pilots were flying an aircraft that was forgiving and easy to handle, while German pilots were flying aircraft that were unforgiving and difficult. The result was predictable. Green German pilots died in droves, often on their first or second combat missions, never having a chance to develop the skills that might have kept them alive. The Mustang's benign handling characteristics meant that even inexperienced American pilots had a fighting chance, while the Bf-109's tricky handling meant that inexperienced German pilots were almost doomed from the start. One of the test pilots, an ace named Franz Stigler who had over 400 combat missions, wrote in his report that flying the Mustang made him feel like he had been fighting with one hand tied behind his back for the entire war. Everything about the aircraft just worked. There were no compromises, no yes, but qualifications. It was simply a superb fighting machine, and fighting against it in inferior aircraft had been, he realized, a form of slow-motion suicide for the Luftwaffe. The comparison testing was particularly revealing. When the captured Mustang was flown against a Bf-109 G6, one of the most common German fighters of late 1944 and early 1945, the results were sobering. The Mustang was faster at all altitudes. It could outclimb the 109 above 20,000 feet. It could outdive it. It had a better roll rate. Its turning radius was slightly worse at low speeds but better at high speeds. And it had more than 3 times the range. The only advantage the Bf-109 showed was a slightly tighter turning radius at low speeds and low altitudes, where the Mustang's greater weight worked against it. But this was a marginal advantage that could only be exploited in specific circumstances, and it was vastly outweighed by the Mustang's superiority in every other regime. Against an FW-198, the comparison was similar. The Focke-Wulf was an excellent aircraft, beloved by German pilots for its ruggedness, firepower, and good handling. But against the Mustang, it was simply outclassed. The Mustang was faster, could fly higher, had better range, and had superior high-speed handling. The FW-190 had better roll rate at low speeds and heavier armament, but these advantages weren't enough to overcome the Mustang's overall superiority. What made these results particularly disheartening for the German pilots was the realization that they had known, on some level, that they were outmatched, but actually quantifying exactly how outmatched they were made it undeniable. The numbers didn't lie. The Mustang was simply a better aircraft, and American pilots flying it had an inherent advantage that German pilots couldn't overcome through skill alone. The question naturally arose during these tests why Germany hadn't developed something similar. The answer was complex and painful. German aeronautical engineering was excellent, Germany had produced innovative and capable aircraft throughout the war. But by 1943, when the Mustang was entering service, Germany was already losing the industrial and resource war. The Luftwaffe had spread its resources across too many projects. There were constant inter-service rivalries, design bureaus competing for resources, and strategic confusion about what was actually needed. Worse, German leadership had become increasingly detached from reality, demanding wonder weapons and miracle solutions rather than focusing on producing adequate numbers of good, reliable aircraft. The Mustang, by contrast, was the product of a focused, well-resourced development program backed by a nation with unlimited industrial capacity. North American aviation had the resources to refine the design, to test thoroughly, to incorporate feedback from combat pilots, and to produce the aircraft in enormous quantities. By the time the German test pilots flew the captured Mustang, over 15,000 had been produced, with more rolling off assembly lines every day. Germany, meanwhile, was still trying to field too many different types, each in inadequate numbers, each suffering from quality control issues as experienced factory workers were drafted and replaced with forced laborers who had no incentive to do good work. The contrast between the precision construction of the Mustang and the increasingly shoddy quality of late-war German aircraft was a metaphor for the broader war. One side had the resources and organization to do things right. The other side was desperately improvising and failing. The psychological impact of flying the Mustang on these German test pilots cannot be overstated. These were men who had believed, at least early in the war, in their technical and tactical superiority. They had been told by their leadership that German engineering was the best in the world, that German pilots were invincible, that victory was inevitable. Flying the Mustang shattered those illusions completely. Here was proof, undeniable and visceral, that Germany had been surpassed. The Americans had built a better fighter, had trained better pilots, and had produced them in numbers that made German production look pathetic. The air war was lost not because German pilots lacked courage or skill, but because they had been asked to fight with inferior tools against overwhelming numbers. For men like Hauptmann Bahr and his fellow test pilots, this realization was both liberating and devastating. Liberating because it meant their losses hadn't been due to personal failure, they had been fighting at a systemic disadvantage from the start. Devastating because it meant the war was truly lost, that all the sacrifice and death had been for nothing, that Germany had no answer to American industrial and technical superiority. The reports written by these pilots were filed with the High Command, though by March 1945, it's unclear who, if anyone, actually read them or what difference they could have made. The test pilots recommended that all German pilots be briefed on the Mustang's capabilities and trained in specific tactics that might mitigate the performance disadvantage. They recommended avoiding combat with Mustangs whenever possible, engaging only when absolutely necessary and then only with superior numbers and altitude advantage. These recommendations were, of course, completely impractical. German fighters couldn't avoid combat with Mustangs. The Mustangs were everywhere, escorting bombers, conducting fighter sweeps, strafing airfields. German fighters had to engage or abandon the skies entirely. And fighting only with superior numbers and altitude advantage was impossible when you were outnumbered and when the enemy could climb higher than you could. The reality was that the Luftwaffe was beaten, and flying the captured Mustang had simply made that defeat impossible to deny. The test pilots knew it. The combat pilots knew it. Probably even the High Command knew it, though they would never admit it publicly. Germany had lost the air war, and with it, any hope of winning the larger conflict. But the story of the captured Mustang doesn't end with those test flights in March 1945. The aircraft itself disappeared in the chaos of the war's final weeks. It may have been destroyed in an Allied air raid on Rechlin. It may have been captured by advancing Soviet forces. It may have been deliberately destroyed by retreating German forces to prevent its recapture. We simply don't know. What we do know is that the reports written by the German test pilots survived, preserved in archives that would later be captured by Allied forces. After the war, these reports were studied carefully by aviation historians and military analysts. They provided unique insight into how the Germans viewed Allied aircraft and confirmed what Allied pilots had known from combat experience. The P-51 Mustang was the finest all-around fighter aircraft of World War II. The German pilots themselves had varying fates. Some, like Hauptmann Bahr, survived the war and went on to have careers in post-war aviation. Bahr himself became a civilian pilot and later a test pilot for various aircraft companies. He would occasionally speak about his experience flying the captured Mustang, always with a mixture of professional admiration and rueful acknowledgement of what that aircraft had meant for Germany's defeat. Other test pilots weren't so fortunate. Some died in the final weeks of the war, shot down in combat or killed in accidents as Germany's military machine disintegrated. Some were captured by Soviet forces and disappeared into prison camps, never to be seen again. The final months of the war were chaos, and many records were lost or destroyed. For the American pilots who had flown the Mustang in combat, the German test reports, when they eventually learned of them, provided a form of validation. They had known they were flying a superior aircraft, but having that confirmed by enemy pilots who had flown it themselves added an extra layer of satisfaction. The Mustang had earned the respect even of those who had fought against it most desperately. The P-51 Mustang would go on to serve in air forces around the world for decades after World War II ended. It saw combat in Korea, where it proved less effective against jet fighters but remained valuable for ground attack. It served in smaller air forces well into the 1980s. The design was so sound that civilian versions became popular racing and sport aircraft, and restored Mustangs remain highly sought-after warbirds to this day. But perhaps the greatest tribute to the Mustang is the admission by those German test pilots in March 1945 that they had never seen handling like it, that it was the aircraft they wished they had been flying, that it was simply the best fighter they had ever encountered. This admission, coming from some of the most experienced combat and test pilots in the world, men who had flown dozens of different aircraft types in the most demanding conditions imaginable, carries tremendous weight. The story of the captured Mustang is more than just an interesting historical footnote. It's a case study in how technological superiority, backed by industrial capacity and sound design philosophy, can determine the outcome of conflicts. The Mustang didn't win the air war over Europe by itself. Numbers mattered. Allied production vastly exceeded German production, and sheer quantity has a quality all its own, but the quality of the Mustang meant that each one was more effective than its German opponents, and that multiplied the effect of numerical superiority. It's also a story about the nature of warfare and how professional soldiers can recognize and respect the capabilities of their enemies even while fighting against them. The German test pilots didn't hate the Mustang. They admired it, even as they understood that it represented their defeat. There's something deeply human in that ability to separate professional assessment from emotional reaction, to acknowledge excellence even when that excellence is being used against you. In the broader context of World War II aviation, the Mustang represents the moment when American aeronautical engineering came of age. In 1940, American fighters were generally considered inferior to their European counterparts. The P-40 was adequate but not exceptional. The P-39 Airacobra was troubled and unpopular. Early American design showed promise but lacked refinement. The Mustang changed all that. It proved that American designers could create world-class aircraft that not only matched but exceeded anything produced elsewhere. It established design principles, long range, pilot-centric ergonomics, rugged reliability that would characterize American military aviation for decades to come. The F-86 Sabre, the F for Phantom, the F-15 Eagle, all owe something to the Mustang's legacy. For the Luftwaffe pilots who flew that captured Mustang in March 1945, the experience was both the highlight and the lowest point of their professional careers. They had been given the opportunity that every fighter pilot dreams of, to fly the enemy's best aircraft, to understand it from the inside, to see exactly what they had been up against. But that opportunity came with the bitter knowledge that understanding their opponent's superiority changed nothing. The war was lost, their comrades were dead, and all the skill and courage in the world couldn't overcome the fundamental disadvantage they had been fighting under. One pilot, whose name appears in the test reports only as Lieutenant W., wrote a particularly poignant passage in his evaluation. He noted that flying the Mustang made him think of all the young pilots he had seen die, boys really, with barely 100 hours of flight time, thrown into combat against American pilots with 3 times the training, flying an aircraft that was superior in nearly every way. He wrote that understanding the Mustang's capabilities now, with the war almost over, felt like a cruel joke. Where had this understanding been in 1943, when it might have mattered? Where had the honest assessment been when pilots were still being told that German fighters were superior, that only pilot skill and determination mattered? This touches on one of the darker aspects of the Luftwaffe's experience in the later war years. There was a significant disconnect between the reality that frontline pilots experienced and the picture presented by leadership. Combat pilots knew they were outmatched. They knew that American fighters had superior performance and that American pilots were well-trained and aggressive. But officially, this couldn't be acknowledged because it contradicted the narrative of Axis superiority that the regime required. Pilots who spoke too honestly about the difficulties they faced, who questioned tactics or equipment, risked being labeled defeatist. In the paranoid atmosphere of late-war Germany, such labels could be dangerous. So many pilots kept their doubts to themselves, continued flying hopeless missions, and watched their friends die while maintaining the fiction that victory was still possible. The captured Mustang test flights represented a rare moment of complete honesty. These were test pilots, not combat squadron leaders, and their job was to provide accurate technical assessments. They could say what frontline pilots couldn't, that German fighters were outclassed, that the situation was hopeless, that the air war was lost. The reports they filed were brutally frank because they had to be. Technical assessments based on wishful thinking were worthless. But even these honest reports existed in a vacuum. By March 1945, Germany was in its death throes. Soviet forces were approaching Berlin from the east. American and British forces were crossing the Rhine in the west. The industrial base was shattered. Fuel was virtually non-existent. Even if the Mustang test reports had contained the secret to defeating Allied air superiority, there were no resources left to implement any solutions. This sense of futility permeates the test reports when you read them with historical hindsight. These pilots were conducting professional, thorough evaluations of an enemy aircraft while the world collapsed around them. It's reminiscent of the orchestra playing as the Titanic sank, professionals continuing to do their jobs even when the outcome was no longer in doubt. There's something both admirable and tragic in that dedication to duty even in the face of inevitable defeat. The technical details documented in these reports are valuable to aviation historians, but the human element is perhaps more interesting. Reading between the lines, you can sense the mixture of emotions these pilots must have felt. Professional admiration for an excellently designed aircraft. Frustration at having to fight against such a machine with inferior equipment. Anger at leadership that had squandered Germany's early advantages and led them to this point. Resignation to the inevitable outcome. And perhaps, underneath it all, relief that the whole nightmare was almost over. Several of the test pilots later said in interviews, years after the war, that flying the Mustang had been a transformative experience. One said it was like seeing clearly for the first time after years of looking through a fog. Another said it felt like understanding the punchline to a joke that had been killing you. The Mustang made concrete and undeniable what they had suspected but couldn't quite articulate, that they had been beaten not by better pilots but by a better system, better aircraft, better resources, better everything. This realization was actually important for their post-war psychological adjustment. Many German pilots struggled with guilt and shame after the war, wondering if they could have done more, fought harder, been more skilled. Understanding that they had been fighting at a systemic disadvantage, that no amount of individual effort could have changed the outcome, helped some of them come to terms with their experiences. The American pilots who flew Mustangs in combat had their own perspective on the aircraft, of course. For them, it wasn't about technical superiority in the abstract. It was about having a machine that gave them a fighting chance, that could get them home, that didn't let them down when they needed it most. Many American pilots loved their Mustangs with an intensity that non-pilots might find difficult to understand. That aircraft wasn't just a tool. It was a partner, a protector, the difference between life and death. There are countless stories of Mustangs bringing their pilots home despite horrific damage, of engines that kept running when they should have ceased, of airframes that held together under stresses that should have torn them apart. The P-51 was tough and reliable in ways that inspired confidence. Pilots trusted it, and that trust was well-founded. The aircraft had been engineered not just for performance but for survivability and reliability. This is another area where the Mustang excelled compared to German fighters. Late-war German aircraft were often mechanically unreliable, suffering from quality control issues as experienced workers were replaced and as materials became scarce. Pilots never knew if their aircraft would make it through a mission. Engines failed, systems malfunctioned, and sometimes aircraft simply fell apart in flight due to poor construction. The Mustang, built in American factories with strict quality control and abundant materials, was remarkably reliable. Mechanical failures were rare. When properly maintained, the aircraft could be counted on to perform mission after mission without problems. This reliability meant that American pilots could focus on fighting rather than worrying about their aircraft, another subtle but significant advantage. The German test pilots noted this quality of construction in their reports. They observed that every rivet was properly set, every panel fit precisely, every system worked as designed. This wasn't just about performance. It was about a level of industrial capability that Germany could no longer match. The Mustang was a product of a nation with the resources to do things right, to not cut corners, to build machines that worked properly every time. One particularly telling observation in the reports concerned the Mustang's maintenance requirements. The American aircraft was designed to be maintained by semi-skilled personnel using standard tools. Panels came off easily for inspection. Systems were accessible. Everything was logical and well documented. German aircraft, by contrast, often required specialized tools and highly trained mechanics to service properly. As experienced personnel became scarce, maintenance standards on German aircraft declined, leading to more mechanical failures and accidents. This attention to maintainability might seem like a minor detail, but it had enormous strategic implications. An aircraft that could be quickly and easily maintained by less skilled personnel meant higher serviceability rates, more missions flown, more combat power available. The Americans understood that the total system, aircraft, pilot, ground crew, logistics, had to work together efficiently. The Germans, despite their engineering prowess, had focused primarily on the aircraft itself and neglected the broader system. The Mustang also benefited from continuous improvement based on combat experience. The P-51D model that the German pilots flew represented years of refinement. Early Mustangs had issues that were identified and fixed. The bubble canopy was added to improve visibility. The gun sight was upgraded. The engine was refined. American engineers listened to feedback from combat pilots and made changes to improve the aircraft. German aircraft development, by contrast, became increasingly chaotic as the war progressed. There were constant demands for more speed, more firepower, more altitude performance, but these demands often conflicted and led to compromised designs. Worse, feedback from combat pilots was sometimes ignored if it contradicted what leadership wanted to hear. The result was aircraft that didn't always meet operational needs. The test pilots flying the captured Mustang could see all of this in the details of the aircraft's design. Every choice made by North American aviation's engineers reflected a clear understanding of what fighter combat required and what pilots needed. The German pilots recognized this because they were experienced enough to understand good design when they saw it. They knew what mattered in a fighter aircraft, and the Mustang had it all. There's a particular passage in Hauptmann Barr's report that stands out. He wrote that flying the Mustang made him realize that the Americans had approached fighter design from a fundamentally different perspective than Germany had. German fighters were designed to be fast, maneuverable, and heavily armed, but the human factor was often secondary. American fighters, or at least the Mustang, were designed around the pilot. Every system, every feature, existed to make the pilot more effective. The aircraft was a tool designed to extend human capability, not a machine that the human had to adapt to. This philosophical difference might seem subtle, but it had profound practical implications. A pilot flying a Mustang could focus almost entirely on tactics and combat because the aircraft required minimal effort to fly. A pilot flying a Bf-109 had to devote significant mental capacity to just controlling the aircraft, especially at high speeds or in combat maneuvers. This cognitive load made German pilots less effective, particularly less experienced pilots who didn't have the skills to operate their aircraft instinctively. The German test pilots recognized this because they had flown both types extensively. They understood that the Mustang's easy handling wasn't a sign of it being a simple or unsophisticated aircraft. It was evidence of sophisticated engineering that had successfully hidden complexity behind intuitive controls and forgiving characteristics. Making an aircraft easy to fly while maintaining high performance is actually much harder than building an aircraft that's fast but difficult to control. As the test program continued through March 1945, the captured Mustang flew numerous sorties, racking up hours as different pilots evaluated different aspects of its performance. They tested it in mock combat against German fighters, running dogfight scenarios to understand tactics. They tested it at different altitudes and speeds, mapping out its flight envelope. They evaluated its ground handling, its takeoff and landing characteristics, its behavior at the edges of its performance limits. Every test confirmed what the first flights had suggested. This was a superior aircraft. There were no hidden weaknesses to exploit, no vulnerabilities that German pilots could take advantage of. Fighting against the Mustang in a German fighter meant you were at a disadvantage, and only superior tactics or numerical superiority could level the odds. The mock combat trials were particularly illuminating. When a Mustang fought against a Bf-109 with both pilots knowing each aircraft's capabilities, the Mustang pilot could almost always dictate the terms of the engagement. They could choose to fight or break off at will. They could force the 109 into unfavorable positions. The 109 pilot, meanwhile, had limited options. They could try to exploit their slight advantage in low-speed turning, but achieving that required getting slow, which made them vulnerable. Any attempt to extend away from the fight and reset was futile because the Mustang was faster. Against the FW-190, the results were similar. The Focke-Wulf was a fine aircraft, but it simply couldn't match the Mustang's combination of speed, altitude performance, and range. In a low-altitude turning fight, the 190 had chances, but at the altitudes where bomber escort missions were flown, the Mustang dominated. These mock combat trials weren't just academic exercises. They were attempts to develop tactics that might help German pilots survive encounters with Mustangs. But the conclusion was discouraging. The best tactic was to avoid combat entirely if possible. If combat was unavoidable, German pilots should attack with altitude and speed advantage, make one pass, and immediately disengage. Extended dogfighting with Mustangs was suicide. These recommendations were already known to experienced Luftwaffe combat pilots. They had learned them the hard way, through bitter experience and high casualties. But having test pilots confirm these conclusions with detailed technical analysis added weight to what combat pilots had been saying all along: fighting Mustangs in the aircraft Germany had available was a losing proposition. What makes the story of the captured Mustang particularly poignant is that it came so late in the war. Had this evaluation been conducted in 1943, perhaps some lessons could have been applied to German fighter development. Perhaps resources could have been reallocated. Perhaps training could have been adapted. But by March 1945, such considerations were meaningless. Germany had no time, no resources, no capacity to implement any changes. The test flights continued until sometime in April 1945, when the military situation finally made them impossible. The Rechlin test facility was threatened by advancing Allied forces. Fuel became so scarce that flying was restricted to only the most essential missions. Personnel were evacuated or reassigned to combat units in desperate last-ditch defensive efforts. The captured Mustang, along with numerous other test aircraft, was either destroyed or abandoned. The final fate of that specific aircraft remains unknown. It wasn't captured by Western Allied forces, at least no records suggest it was. It may have fallen into Soviet hands, but if so, they left no records that have since been discovered. Most likely, it was destroyed to prevent its recapture, either deliberately by German forces or in the general destruction that accompanied the war's end. But the reports survived. They were found in archives captured by American forces after the war, along with thousands of other technical documents. American intelligence personnel recognized their value and had them translated and analyzed. The reports confirmed much of what American pilots and engineers already knew about the Mustang's capabilities, but they also provided unique insights into German thinking and German aircraft capabilities. Some of the German pilots who had flown the captured Mustang survived the war and were interviewed by American intelligence officers. These interviews, conducted in prisoner-of-war camps in 1945 and 1946, provide additional context to the written reports. The pilots were surprisingly candid, perhaps because the war was over and there was no longer any point in maintaining propaganda narratives. Hauptmann Barr, in his interview, stated flatly that the Mustang was the best fighter aircraft of the war, bar none. He had flown virtually every significant fighter type, German, American, British, and captured Soviet aircraft. He had combat experience in numerous types and test experience in even more. His assessment carried tremendous weight, and American intelligence officers took note. Other pilots echoed this assessment. One observed that if Germany had possessed Mustangs instead of Bf-109s, the air war would have turned out very differently. This was probably an overstatement. Numerical and industrial advantages would still have favored the Allies, but it speaks to the respect these pilots had for the aircraft. They recognized that superior equipment matters, that technology can be a decisive factor, that being asked to fight with inferior tools makes victory difficult or impossible. These interviews also revealed interesting details about the Luftwaffe's understanding of American tactics and capabilities. German pilots had tremendous respect for American fighter pilots, whom they regarded as well-trained, aggressive, and tactically competent. They noted that American formations were flexible and adaptive, that American pilots communicated effectively and supported each other well, and that the overall American air combat system was highly effective. This respect was mutual. American pilots who flew against the Luftwaffe recognized that their opponents were skilled and dangerous. Many American aces spoke highly of German pilot ability, noting that even late in the war, surviving German pilots were formidable opponents. The difference was that American pilots had better aircraft, better training, more fuel to practice with, and the knowledge that they had numerical superiority. The story of the captured Mustang thus becomes a lens through which we can examine the broader air war over Europe. It's not just about one aircraft or one set of test flights. It's about how technological advantage, combined with industrial capacity and sound operational doctrine, determined the outcome of the struggle for air superiority. The Mustang succeeded because it was the right aircraft at the right time, built by a nation with the resources to produce it in quantity and the wisdom to get the design right. It succeeded because American engineers understood that fighter combat required a specific set of characteristics: speed, altitude performance, range, handling, reliability, and they created an aircraft that delivered all of them without significant compromise. Germany, despite its early successes and undeniable engineering talent, failed to create an equivalent. This failure wasn't due to lack of skill or knowledge. German engineers were excellent, and they produced many innovative designs. The failure was systemic. Germany spread its resources too thin, pursued too many competing projects, ignored pilot feedback when it was inconvenient, and above all, simply lacked the industrial capacity to produce superior aircraft in the quantities needed. The German test pilots who flew the captured Mustang understood all of this. Their reports are remarkable documents, not just for their technical content but for their unflinching honesty about Germany's situation. These men knew the war was lost. They knew why it was lost. And they documented their conclusions with professional precision, creating a historical record that helps us understand both the Mustang's excellence and the Luftwaffe's defeat. In the decade since World War II ended, the P-51 Mustang has achieved legendary status. It appears in countless books, documentaries, and films. Restored examples are cherished by collectors and aviation enthusiasts. The distinctive sound of a Merlin engine and the sight of that sleek silver fighter have become iconic symbols of the Allied victory in Europe. But perhaps the most meaningful tribute to the Mustang comes not from those who flew it for America, but from those German pilots who flew against it and then, briefly, had the chance to fly it themselves. Their admission that they had never seen handling like it, that it was the aircraft they wished they had been flying, that it was simply superior to anything they had encountered, carries a weight that no amount of Allied propaganda could match. These were experienced combat pilots, men who had survived years of brutal aerial combat, who had flown the best aircraft Germany could produce, and who had every reason to minimize the capabilities of enemy equipment. But they didn't minimize. They told the truth. The Mustang was better. Significantly better. And that truth helps explain why the Luftwaffe, despite the skill and courage of its pilots, was ultimately defeated in the struggle for air superiority over Europe. The human element of this story is perhaps its most compelling aspect. War reduces people to statistics: aircraft shot down, pilots killed, missions flown. But behind those statistics were individuals, human beings with families, dreams, and fears. The German pilots who flew the captured Mustang were not monsters or fanatics. They were professional military officers doing their jobs under increasingly impossible circumstances. Their reports, clinical and technical as they are, reveal human beings grappling with defeat and trying to understand how it happened. They reveal professionals who could appreciate excellence even in an enemy weapon, who could separate their assessment of the aircraft from their feelings about the nation that built it. There's something deeply human in that ability, something that reminds us that even in the brutality of war, people remain capable of objectivity and professional respect. For the American pilots and engineers who created and flew the Mustang, the German test reports, when they eventually learned of them, must have provided a form of vindication. They had built something excellent, something that even their most skilled enemies had to acknowledge was superior. That's a rare achievement in any field, creating something so good that even those who desperately wanted to find flaws couldn't do so. The Mustang's design team, led by Edgar Schmude, had set out to build the best fighter aircraft possible. They succeeded beyond what even they might have imagined. They created an aircraft that could escort bombers to any target in Europe and bring them home. They created an aircraft that could fight and win against any opponent. They created an aircraft that would serve in air forces around the world for decades. And they created an aircraft that would earn the reluctant respect even of German pilots who flew against it. In the final analysis, the story of German pilots flying a captured Mustang is a story about excellence, about what happens when design, engineering, and manufacturing all come together to create something truly superior. It's a story about the harsh realities of technological warfare, where better equipment can mean the difference between victory and defeat, survival and death. It's also a story about the end of an era. The Mustang represented the pinnacle of piston engine fighter development. Within a few years, jet aircraft would make piston fighters obsolete. The Mustang would see combat in Korea, but it was already being superseded by jets like the F-86 Sabre. The age of propeller-driven fighters, the age that had produced such legendary aircraft as the Spitfire, the Zero, the Bf-109, and the Mustang itself, was drawing to a close. Those German test pilots in March 1945 were among the last people to evaluate cutting-edge piston fighter technology before it became obsolete. They were witnesses to the end of an era, even as they were witnesses to the end of their own nation's military power. The Mustang they flew represented both the pinnacle of its type and the beginning of its obsolescence. But for that brief moment in the spring of 1945, before jets became dominant, before the war ended, before everything changed, those German pilots had the opportunity to fly what they themselves acknowledged was the finest fighter aircraft in the world. They flew it with professional skill, evaluated it with analytical precision, and documented their findings with unflinching honesty. Their conclusion was simple and devastating. The Mustang was better. Better than anything Germany had produced. Better than anything they had flown. Better in ways that made fighting against it in lesser aircraft a form of slow-motion defeat. This wasn't opinion or propaganda. This was professional assessment from some of the most experienced fighter pilots in the world. And that assessment, preserved in those dusty reports and interview transcripts, stands as perhaps the most meaningful tribute the P-51 Mustang ever received. When even your most skilled enemies admit defeat, when even those who flew against you acknowledge your superiority, when even those who desperately wanted to find flaws cannot do so, that's the ultimate validation. The German pilots who flew the captured Mustang gave it that validation. They admitted they had never seen handling like it. They acknowledged it was the aircraft they wished they had been flying. They documented its superiority in detail and without reservation. In doing so, they helped cement the Mustang's place in history not just as a good fighter or even a great fighter, but as one of the finest aircraft ever built. That captured Mustang, sitting on a German airfield in the dying days of the Third Reich, represented more than just one aircraft. It represented American industrial might, engineering excellence, and the triumph of sound design philosophy over desperate improvisation. It represented the defeat of the Luftwaffe and the victory of Allied air power. And it represented a moment when professional soldiers on opposite sides of a brutal conflict could find common ground in appreciation of a truly exceptional machine. The pilots who flew it understood all of this. Their reports say it explicitly. The Mustang was more than just an aircraft. It was a symbol of why Germany had lost the air war and, by extension, why Germany had lost the war itself. Superior resources, superior organization, superior technology, all embodied in one sleek silver fighter that could fly higher, faster, and farther than anything Germany could produce. When those German pilots climbed down from the cockpit after flying the Mustang, they carried with them the bitter knowledge of defeat and the professional recognition of excellence. They had seen the future, and it belonged to America. They had flown the aircraft that had beaten them, and they had to admit, it was magnificent. That admission, forced from experienced warriors by undeniable reality, may be the most powerful testimony to the P-51 Mustang's greatness. Not the victory statistics, not the production numbers, not the technical specifications, but the simple acknowledgement from the enemy's best pilots that they had been beaten by a better machine. In the end, that's what the story of the captured Mustang tells us. In warfare, in technology, in any competitive endeavor, excellence matters. Superior performance matters. Getting the details right matters. The Mustang was excellent, performed superbly, and got the details right. That's why it succeeded. That's why it earned the respect even of those who fought against it. And that's why, 80 years later, we still tell its story.